and welcome to the Grace Hour show, everyone. This is a Christian program. We're taking a dive into some of the challenges that face us in the faith, and this is a new week of broadcasts, and we're talking about prayer warriors through church history, historic prayer warriors. And today, I'm Pastor Steve Andrulonis with Greater Grace Church, and with me is Pastor Renaldo Brown, and we are talking about a man named Brother Lawrence. And you perhaps have read bits or pieces of his book, a book that was a collection of prayers and maxims and letters that were released after he died. Brother Lawrence lived in the early 1600s in France, and the practice of the presence of God became like a very popular handbook. This is during a period of time when France was in some religious upheaval. The Huguenots, which were the reformed members of the French society, they were sort of put upon and driven out. And the other, Brother Lawrence was a member and a friar in the Catholic Church. And, he was also just really devoted to walking with God. So we're going to talk about his life and some of the practical and spiritual instructions that he had. This is a mystical frame of reference we're talking about. There's others from France. Madame Guyon is one of them. Sure. Also a man named Fenelon. These were all people that stayed within the framework of the institutional church they were a part of, but really tried to devise a deeper spiritual life built upon what they knew from the scriptures. I think that's the great point that we want to make about all three of these people. French, all of them, in a very torturous time in the history of France, but trying to make sense of having God with them. So the practice of the presence of God. Yeah. Let's talk.
Sure. I like his choice. When you walk down the corridor of time and you think about people whose life and their words have impacted people's prayer life for centuries. Yeah, Brother Lawrence is in the conversation. Lawrence of the Resurrection is like what I love about his life is that he himself was not notable, but the way he lived his life was very notable. When you study his life, you find it's very easy to identify with his life. But what's different about him is that his perspective is not very easily identifiable. But his lifestyle, you could say, that's me. I have that kind of life. I feel like him. I'm living his life, but I don't have his perspective.
That's true.
Or and when you read his book, it's a devotional book. It's a really small book. He's got a copy right here. Yeah. It's an easy read. I try to read it once a year. I try to go through it once a year. And every time I try to ask God for freshness because he has such great words. And the simplicity of his words. He's not so eloquent.
No.
And in fact, he will tell you that he was worried when he joined the monastery that he would suffer because he wasn't so eloquent.
That's true.
He said, I might be the dumbest guy to enter the monastery, so I'm not going to be this literary genius. And yet, of all the guys he served with, we're reading his writings today,
That's true.
Not those writings today. But when you read his book, The Practice of the Presence of God, because of what you heard, or the title alone says, okay, we're going to get into this deep meditative state of fasting and prayer and just being quiet for God and all the spiritual disciplines of solitude, all those things that you're getting hyped up for this. You want to light a candle, sit alone, get ready, like, okay, talk to me. And then you read the story, he's washing dishes, he's cooking food, he's doing laundry. You're like, wait a minute. He's doing chores.
Exactly.
he's doing chores. Now, I put my chores down to learn about him. Yeah. And he says in his book, pick your chores back up.
That's right.
And learn about God.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting read. He himself is equally as exciting as what he has to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point that you're making. When he's talking about the practice of the presence of God, he's not talking about finding a quiet room or a cave somewhere or a mountaintop or even like Simon Stylites, a pole lifted up. He's talking about practical living and thanking God, and whatever your hand finds to do, God is with you.
Right.
And I think that's the the takeaway, I too, it's one of the books that I pick up every now and then. There's another one called Praying Hide.
Yeah.
And both of them are sort of like, when you think like you need some freshness in prayer, you go back and you find like two guys. Praying Hide was one in what's now Pakistan. Mm-hmm. He was a minister there, and we see like his practical approach to the thing. And Brother Lawrence is the same way. It's like in both situations, these guys purpose to bring God into the ordinary flow of their lives. And this is their legacy for us. It's like, when God says pray without ceasing, then this is a definition for it, right?
That's a great word. I like what you just said there. This is today's program. If you're listening to the program, today's program is the beginning approach to prayer.
Yes.
This is the starter. This is like the kindergarten. This is like the base. Before you get into vocabulary, before you get into a closet or location or timing, this is the thing you want to start from. Before you get into vocabulary, you want to get into presence, atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And one thing Brother Lawrence emphasized is the necessity for a spiritual atmosphere, regardless of wherever you are. And from that atmosphere springs prayer. Because imagine for a moment you get mechanical and you avoid this whole presence of God thing, and you just try to start off with prayer. Mm-hmm. If you skip this piece, we heard it last night, your prayers in Jude 20, you're not praying in the Spirit.
That's right. That's true.
See, in Jude 20, how am I to praying in the Spirit? I begin with the Spirit. And then there's an Ephesians 5:18 that comes in first. Before, and then maybe even in Romans 8:14, I'm led in my prayers. We wouldn't be led in our speech to people. How about being led in my speech to God? And Brother Lawrence taps into that. I like him for the sake that he takes me back to my foundation. Sometimes you feel you pray the wrong way. James 4:3, you pray amiss. You feel you don't pray when you should. You feel you pray if your prayer life is stale, stagnant, maybe you feel out of communion with God, go back to this. Let's go back to this principle of the presence of God. And I like the way his life began. I kind of divided his life a little bit into sections.
Yeah, it's good.
I like to study his life.
Yeah, let's hear about it.
The first one is his start. And his start is in the middle of the 30 Years' War. He is born in a time of war, France and Central Europe, like you said earlier with the Huguenots. There's a lot going on in the world.
Very religious war.
Yeah, a religious war. So you're not only choosing sides, you're really choosing your view of God, which is when God and your politics are united, you have a certain identity that's very strong, and you're very demonstrative for something and against something. And this was happening in the 30 Years' War. And he is born into poverty. And when you're born into poverty, you can't find a job. So what do? Even today, what do? You join the military.
Yeah.
Because in the military, you get training, you get health care, you get meals.
You get a uniform.
Uniform, respect to some degree.
And
you get a little bit of cash. So he jumped in. And his start was interesting as a soldier. One story he talks about in his book, around 16, 17, he's in the middle of a battlefield of a war has just been fought, or battle has just been fought. He's kind of going through, I guess, he's on patrol. And he sees this tree I guess in the winter, it's the German side, it's this tree that has no leaves on it. And when he sees this tree, it's not, for some reason, at this particular moment, it speaks to him.
Yeah. That's right.
And it's winter, and he says, that tree that has no leaves will have leaves again. Maybe he saw a bud starting to shoot out from the tree, but he saw life in a lifeless tree. And for the first time in his life, born into poverty, having no skills and having no job and being a young soldier with no training at all formally, he saw hope. And when you can take a lot of things from a man, you can give a lot of things to a man. But when you give him hope, you give him purpose. You give him validation. You give him an identity. You give him a reason to wake up in the morning. And in that little moment, for the first time, he kind of encapsulated that God could do something. He could make something out of a dead life. And that, in some respects, that dead tree, or seemingly dead tree, was his life. And if God can produce life in that seemingly dead tree, then God could produce life in this seemingly dead life. So he continues. This is how he began. And then he fought in the 30 Years' War. He was captured a few times. One time he was tortured and threatened with hanging for being a spy, but he somehow courageously convinced them that he wasn't a spy. I don't know how you talk somebody out of not being a spy, but he talked them out of it. A village he was in, he was wounded. Shocking numbers. That village, the beginning population before the war was 2,600 people, roughly. And after 8 years later, it was down to 400 people. Just massacred people.
Yeah, lots of.
In that battle, he got hurt.
Death. Yeah.
So he left the battlefield. So now he's no longer a soldier. He goes to his parents' house and he convalesces. He gets healed. And while he's doing that, he now becomes a servant. He's a valet. He starts working for a treasurer. And he's a horrible valet, by the way. It seems like everything so far that Brother Lawrence puts his hands to comes to nothing.
Can't do. Yeah, he can't.
He's a poor soldier. He's not a great valet. He said all he can remember from the entire trip is that he was a clumsy guy and he broke everything. So that's a lousy valet. But that's who he was. But if you continue to try at life and you fail, you begin to think you're a failure.
Yeah.
At some point, he's beginning to think there's not much I can do. I don't speak well. I don't act well. I'm not good at anything. So he decides to follow the footsteps of his uncle. And he joins a monastery. He's 26 years old. He's still young. He had that event in the woods and he was 16, but now 10 years later, he's now becoming a monk. You could say a saint in some ways because he's Catholic. So he kind of joins a monastery for barefoot monks that avoid fleshly food, abstain from several things. And they also swear to poverty, which he had no problem with because he was already poor.
That's true.
It was easy to step into that. So he pretty much makes a confession at 26 years old to be a monk. He comes in as a monk and he's like a lay brother. He's like a starter. And he's immediately put to work at the worst jobs. You get the worst jobs when you first come in. Even in a monastery, what are you doing? You're cleaning, you're cooking, and you're serving, and you're washing. Now first of all, this was something that he kind of desired because in one respect, it's a place to hide. If I don't speak well, if I'm not very intelligent, I'm in a monastery. Some of these guys came from learned backgrounds.
That's right.
It wasn't the people that were poor who joined monasteries. It was people that had intelligence, that had been higher learning. They joined to serve God. So they were sharp and they were literal. They were scribes. They were writers. He was none of these things.
No. That's right.
So he comes in dumb and says, okay, if I'm dumb joining a monastery, I'm going to do the dumb jobs. And then they won't ask me to speak and they won't put their fingers on me, but God had his finger on Brother Lawrence. And then somehow, some ways, he's beginning to do things in the monastery. A lot of times he's by himself, which is interesting that God put him in a job where he'd be by himself that would challenge him to think with God by himself. And many of us, we don't like to be by ourselves. But for him, what he felt was the safety from men became the sanctuary to God. And he began to have relationships with God and cultivate just fellowshipping with God. And he said the thing that really, really transformed his understanding of the desire for God was the love of God.
Yeah.
He fell in love with God loving him, and he really wanted to fellowship with God loving him, so he would seek the presence of God to experience the love of God. And it began to foster in him a prayer life. Then he spends the rest of his life pretty much working in the kitchen. Later on, he had this leg injury that made it worse from the work in the kitchen. So he ended up just repairing shoes, repairing sandals. But even with his bad English, questionable humor, he began to have this influence. First among the monks that worked with him. Then other people began to come into his life that from higher levels of learning to glean from. He suddenly became a sage. He was like a very sharp, wisdom-oriented person. People like John Wesley, Williamsbury, A.W. Tozer, they all quote from his writings.
Yeah.
Brother Lawrence, it's incredible.
Yeah, I think, the way you're relating his life, he came to a place of, he didn't have, this whole idea of like, if you build your self-esteem, you'll be, you'll be more productive. And he just, found his place in this monastery where he could serve, basically. It's just like he constantly washing feet. And just, now the one thing that he really was like most of these people in this kind of situations, they had sort of this idea of the purification that came with painful experiences.
Yes.
And this was like, this goes all the way back to the early church. During the early days of the martyrs, there were actually people who were over the top and gave themselves to martyrdom, thinking that it would give them a higher standing in the next life. So this is a corruption of truth. I mean, even Polycarp said, when the martyrdom of Polycarp, who was burned in a Roman city, he said that you don't throw yourself at martyrdom. God brings it to you. If you meet you don't avoid it, but you don't dive into it thinking you're going to be a better saint. That's we know that that's another religious orientation. You get more rewards in paradise. But Brother Lawrence was like, he wanted to suffer in order to gain more of a sense of purification.
Yes.
But God tricked him. God just gave him a constant stream of joy. And he even sort of like toward the end of his life, when he was leaving this life, he didn't want any of the comforts, because this was like, so this is part of it. When you're reading it, this is part of the orientation that we have to understand, that, the purification of pain, like it's not something that Jesus taught.
No.
It's not something that the apostles taught. Even though they celebrated when they were worthy of persecution in the book of Acts, but, we don't go looking for those kind of things. No. It's like, we know that the joy of the Lord, it says, right?
Yes.
That is Ezra, right? That is Ezra, the joy, and Nehemiah, the joy of the Lord is your strength. Drink the sweet. Don't mourn. This is a day of celebration. And so Brother Lawrence was, he expresses it in one of his letters that he was kind of disappointed that he didn't have more suffering. It's like God met him so much and gave him so much joy. And this was sort of like the magnet, like you're saying. Yeah. He became a sage because his joyfulness, and because as he's turning his omelet, he's singing to the Lord, or as he's stitching the sandal, he's singing to the Lord and he's talking to God just like that. So
I find it interesting that his message should have been endurance.
Yes.
But it was actually excitement. It was exhilaration. It was like, this is supposed to be difficult. So looking at your life, and this is a good word for us as Christians, people look at our life as restricted, conservative, a life of what you can't do. Christianity, circle with a line through it, no fun. So all the Christianity means is you're just going to tell me what I can't do. So you're in a position of lack or restraint, and it's to your detriment. Brother Lawrence is saying this restraint is actually to my benefit. The position I have is advantageous. It's like you see a dog in a yard, you think the fence is to keep the dog out, but really the fence is to protect the dog from the world. It's his protection, not our protection. You don't put a fence up because you want to keep the dog out of the world. You put a fence up because you want to keep the world out of the neighborhood with the dog. So it's like God puts us in our life to be a living testimony.
Yeah. And
I think sometimes we have these romantic ideas that God's going to use, I'm going to burn out for God in glory, that God's going to drop you off out of an airplane with 1 million tracks over Afghanistan. As you fly down to Afghanistan, you're throwing tracks every direction. Some romantic Hollywood glorious celebration of God, I'm going to burn out for God. Meanwhile, God's plans might be you're in the back of a kitchen with 400 plates by yourself washing dishes. And that's burning out for God.
Yeah, that's burning for God.
There's 2 cooks that walk past you every 4 or 5 hours. That's all you got for that. And your life can feel like that. You can have a Brother Lawrence life and not have Brother Lawrence fruit.
That's true. That's right. Yeah, I like that because I watched a cartoon movie with my wife this weekend, and there was a song in there that said that a star doesn't shine, it burns.
Oh.
And I thought about that because, the sun is a star.
That's
and
true.
It's true. It's true. It's like, so you burn. It's like you burn. And we know that Jesus said that a smoking flax he will not quench. So we know that that's a part. Like if there's any measure of fire in you, it can be revived. And And, Brother Lawrence had a fire for God that he
Yes.
nurtured. And I think that's when we look at that word practice, we think of practicing free throws. We think of practicing, anything, or practicing guitar or piano. We think of practice, and it can be a word that can put us off. It seems too mechanical, but really, like the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. I mean, when you take the steps, when you're looking into the processes of thinking with God, you're right. It begins with an understanding of who He is. It begins with seeing that whatever your hand finds to do, God has given this into your hand. And he would say that, the practice was, the practice that he developed. And he admits that it wasn't like an instant thing.
Yes.
He wasn't constantly walking in the presence of God. It took some concentration. I think that's what he's saying.
Yeah.
Concentrating your thought life to the fact that God is always with you. That could be a subtitle for that.
Yes.
The practice of the presence of God is concentrating your thought and heart life on the fact that God is with you right where you are.
I like that. The Emmanuel principle in my prayer life. The Emmanuel principle in my life before God.
With us.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I don't know, and I sometimes have to catch myself. I don't know if I discern how valuable a provision it is to have God in my life.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, just the fact that God is in your life, what is restrained against you because God is in your life? What is that? I think it's 1 Peter 1:5. We are kept by the power of God, but we're actually also kept by the person of God, which reveals the power of God. The person of God reveals the power of God that is keeping us and sustaining us. I mean, we read Hebrews 11, He sustains the world by the power of His mouth, but He also sustains His people in the world. Matthew 6, He sustains animal life, but He sustains the church, right? Matthew 16, He protects the church. He's a provision. But I like the way He emphasizes the provision for His life was the presence of God in His life.
Yeah.
You don't get this idea that Brother Lawrence did well because he memorized Scripture, though it doesn't say he knew the Scriptures. But that wasn't the foundation of his walk with God. It was him walking in the presence of God, which could lead him to the Scriptures. Because don't forget, he's a French Catholic. So his access to the Scriptures was very narrow.
Yeah, at that point.
So you can look at his life and say, okay, he could have written more Bible. Yeah, he could have. But the focus of his book was not on how much Bible that I know, but more about the principles of the Bible that I'm living.
Yeah.
So I like the fact that he has a very, very practical testimony. The second thing I like is he doesn't jump from spiritual things to non-spiritual things. He doesn't say that you have to pray a certain way, but to his credit, there was organized prayers he participated in.
Yeah.
He wasn't this brigand or this rebel. I'm going to do things my way. He wasn't independent.
Yeah.
Right? But he did have an individual walk with God, and that's important as a believer. Remember, he's in the middle of a war zone. He's in the middle of Catholicism. There's organized prayers according to the Mass and different things. That's all there.
Yeah.
He doesn't avoid that. He's operating in his individuality in Christ in the midst of that.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to do as Christians. God is not asking us to change the world we live in, but He's asking us to live with Him in the world we live in. And by virtue of that, we have an influence as much as an impact.
It's true. I think, like you're saying, is like we're talking about like in this situation that he's in this, there's, I can't help but think of like the husband of Hannah, Elkanah. So, he's like a little hero in the story there. We know about Hannah, we know about her prayer, but we know that even though there was like in the book of Judges, this story comes like right after the book of Judges, when there's no king in Israel, everyone is doing what's right in their own eyes. We know that there's trouble in the nation. We also know that there's trouble in the family because he's got two wives, and the one is barren, that's Hannah, the other. So there's agitation there. And then we also know that Eli has two sons of Belial. So there's three major parts of your life, really. We could say three, your community, nation is in trouble. Your family has turmoil, and the temple, there's evil men that are meeting you at the door, and the father who should be doing something ain't doing anything about it.
Yep.
But we know that Elkanah still brought his family to worship.
That's it.
And I'm thinking that, like, here you see Brother Lawrence, like, took these steps. He brought himself to worship, even in the turmoil. And like you said, he wasn't the all-star. He wasn't the all-star. He wasn't the guy writing the papers, writing the treatises that would talk about the high theological things.
He wasn't Martin Luther.
No, he wasn't. He wasn't Thomas Aquinas or any of those guys. He's just a simple guy, like, going along. But the people recognize that. I most remember, like, he said that he was honest about being distracted.
Yeah.
And he said he would find himself distracted, and he would just, he developed a pattern saying, Lord, I'm sorry. I forgot about you for a moment.
Wow.
Bring me back into your presence. It was just, and you see he makes those spiritual maxims saying, just like recognizing, God, you are all, I can't do this without you. And just sort of having a constant conversation with God. It's the way I've learned a little bit. I'm not perfect about it, but it's the way I've learned to triumph over my agitation at being in bumper-to-bumper traffic. I've had imagining God sitting next to me. And if my family is listening to that, yes, I am getting better. You know that. You have said this as much to me. But, bumper-to-bumper traffic, it's like, what would Brother Lawrence do? Oh, he would talk to God sitting next to him. And I think that's the kind of thing. One other thing, I think, like, biblically, we know that there are several places in the Old Testament where the alphabetizing happens. Like Ezra alphabetized all these thoughts we have about the Word of God in Psalm 119.
Yes.
And we know that the Lamentations and the prayers of Jeremiah are alphabetized in that book according to the letters. So when we look at pattern and practices, we shouldn't be like dismissive of them because they can give us a grounding and a frame of reference that leads us to a deeper life.
That's a good balance. I like that. What I like, it kind of coalesces with what Brother Lawrence is saying. He didn't dismiss the structure of the Catholic Church.
No.
He didn't quit the monastery and go into the mountains and make bread and cheese on his own and said, I got this. He stayed a monk his whole life. He stayed in the system his whole life. He stayed in the Catholic Church his whole life once he joined. From 26, he died at 77. So you're talking about 50 plus years he stayed in the monastery. From 26, when he joined the monastery, to dying at 77, half a century he stayed there. In the half a century that he stayed there, he didn't really change the structure. There's nothing that's been, even I think the very monastery that he was in is still around. That's what I read anyway. But he never changed the structure of the monastery. He never revised. He wasn't Martin Luther. He wasn't this guy that's going to reform the Catholic Church. There was no reformation outside of what was happening in his soul. He said to himself, in my individual walk with God, what is more important to me? That I change this monastery or that God changes my heart in this monastery? And that's a good word for us. We don't have to be these shake our fist at the establishment at every corner, attack every form of government, attack every form of structure and say, that's wrong, rebel, change, renew, free. I don't have to be that guy. I can be Brother Lawrence, and I can, to quote Pastor Schaller, I can learn to do common things in a spiritual way.
Yeah.
I can learn to do common things in a spiritual way. And in 2 Corinthians 3:2, I can have an influence with my life without changing the structures of life.
That's true.
Case in point, you may be in a family that's not very godly. Okay, well, maybe you can't change your family for God. And you may, and praise the Lord, you may, but you may not. Your uncle who's not saved, he might not get saved. The cousin who drinks may not stop drinking. So you can spend your whole life trying to change them, or you can choose in your own individual life to walk with God. And guess what you have? You have a testimony, and your testimony will speak. Because we're reading about in Brother Lawrence's testimony. We're not reading about his sermon. We're not reading about his doctrinal thesis, his systematic theology. We're not reading any of that. We're just reading, basically, the practice of the presence of God is a testimony of Brother Lawrence's life for over 50 years in a French monastery doing nondescript things.
Yeah.
He is a testimony of a man who did simple things spiritually, did common things. He did things that were reprehensible naturally, and he found God in it, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the challenge that I get from it. And I was going to ask you, what are some takeaways you have from this book personally? That's
well,
one of mine.
I just think that, I mean, I think at a certain point, people communicated with him.
Yes.
It's like, there's a proverb that says a man's gift makes room for him, and he comes before the great people. And, he had a gift. It was obvious that he had a gift, and people wrote him letters, and he responded to their letters based on the best spiritual analysis that he could give it. And now, he says, like, I studied to do this. I studied to recognize that God was with me all the time. And he said it wasn't a practice that happened. It wasn't the sense of God being with him that he lived according wasn't like an instantaneous kind of thing. It wasn't but it didn't come, it came to a point where it didn't come and go. And it gave him tremendous joy. Like I said, at a certain point, he's like, the purification of pain wasn't something that God gave me. Instead, he gave me overwhelming joy. He said, sometimes I was so joyful that I had to ask God to help me contain the happiness. Now, you're talking about the structure of being like in a quietist monastery. So, I mean, is he going to leap and praise and run around and praise God? That's not the kind of place that he was in there. But the letters, he's just, they're very simple. They're direct. They're talking about the issue. He says, he talks about how he recovered from failure, how he would give it to God. And he knew that, and the thing is that he also wrestled with the idea of his security as a believer.
Yes.
And that he through constantly talking with God, he came to lose this sense that he was, falling, that, this was a big, we know that Martin Luther talks about the way that he crawled on his knees up this stairway in the Vatican that was, you get to the top, and he didn't find satisfaction there. So, Martin Luther found satisfaction by reading the scriptures, and then God spoke to him out of it. Brother Lawrence found satisfaction in finding God in whatever his hand found to do, and found to do there. So it's like, I think it's not either or, it's both and. Martin Luther's studying Galatians, and it comes out of him, and he realized salvation is this way. Brother Lawrence is thinking, I just can't do anything right. And then, he discovers that, well, maybe if I just commit everything I do to God, I'll at least feel right, or I'll at least have a sense of being with somebody helping me.
Yes.
And it came, and he wrote these things down. Spiritual maxims are in there. He's just talking about just like calling to mind. It's a constant repetitive strain, just thing like, one of his constant refrains in all of these things is like, you are the only way that I can do this, God. Put in me the will to do of your good pleasure. That's the modification. He says, I can't do this without you. Can you help me? I know you're here.
Excellent.
And even though I don't feel it, I know you're here. Just keep talking to him till you get the feeling, right? Fake it till you make it, right?
That's the Emmanuel principle. It's like, okay, this is a good precept. I'm never going to discern God without faith.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, I'm always armed to discern God. The question is, am I going to try to find God without faith, right?
Yeah.
As much as God looks for faith, I need faith to look for God. And Brother Lawrence, when you read his book, you just hear his faith speaking.
Yeah.
From a place of love, our faith speaks. And he's just speaking like, God, I'm not sure I can do this. God, I'm not sure that I'm even connected. And some of these great guys really had deep questions about their relationship with God. C.T. Studd, John Wesley, different ones. They struggled with, am I really all the way in? They were never in a place of complete assurance, is the word I want to say. Because I tend to think that they always kind of looked at it from their side of the conversation.
I got it. Yeah. I know what you're saying.
Versus God's side of the conversation.
Yeah. Right.
So and I'm human, so everything I do is fluid. Everything is suspect. Everything is like, it's good today. I'm not sure what tomorrow. So of course I think way. And you read that, when you get that from Brother Lawrence, when you read, you're like, he's still, as close as he is to God, he still sees this more of himself drawing near to God than God drawing near to him.
Yeah.
And that's a deep, deep foundational principle in your walk with God that we have to come to a conclusion about. Is it me? Is it Hebrews 10:22, me drawing to God, or is it Acts 17:27, God not far, God drawing to me? It's reciprocal. It's a bit of both. But the first step is got to be God, because it ain't man. And the second step is I may reciprocate, but my reciprocation is experiential, which means it's fluid. His reciprocation is positional, which means he's always going to do it. So that takes the pressure off my side of it. But if I don't trust his side of it, I am going to have to depend on my side, which is untrustworthy. And when you read Brother Lawrence's book in a soft way, not so demonstrative, he kind of gives you this thing like, I'm holding on by a thread for half a century. Holding on by a thread like, is he like, but I like in his life, I've jotted down a few things I like. I like his personal humility. Humility is not attractive. It's not immediately profitable, but it always wins. Even when you're wrong, when you're humble, you have a spot for mercy. You got a chance. So his personal humility, he was content to be a nobody for half a century. Even as folks are still coming in, big time guys, education, names, earls, they're all coming to talk to Brother Lawrence. He's repairing sandals. You know, he's like, ooh, he's just sitting there in the loincloth, is sitting there and the say clack this so and and he's having conversations. You know, somebody else has decided to write it down. He's not even suggesting you should write it. Paul said, I have a scribe. No, there was no scribe with Brother Lawrence. Somebody else is just almost eavesdropping. So that's his person. Number two, I like his, I love his simplicity. That's what makes him so identifiable. His simplicity. The things he does, I wash dishes. I try to cook sometimes. People probably better cook than me. I've done laundry. The things he does are stuff that are everyday stuff. There's not a man in the world, a common man, who cannot connect. Because don't forget, at that point in time, theology was for higher men.
That's right. Yeah, it was a very scholastic emphasis.
So he's a lower man. So he shouldn't be there. And most importantly, he shouldn't be getting the rhemas he's getting because he doesn't have it's gracious, really, because he doesn't have the background. He's like, it's sometimes in Christianity, you feel like a Brother Lawrence, like, I'm not qualified to be in this room. I shouldn't be. I don't know I haven't been to Bible school. I don't know. You start disqualifying yourself. And Brother Lawrence is the proof that in the simplicity of humility, you can find God, and more importantly, God can find you.
Great, it's great. Yeah, I mean, Paul made the point in 1 Corinthians 1 that not many wise according to the world are called, and like you said, they wouldn't have been going to his office and looking through his library and trying, to find out. No, they would have to come to his workbench or come to his stove and his frying pan and those kind of things. And I think it's really interesting. Like, I'm really thinking, I've thought a lot about this. Like, would Paul have been the not exalted, but the excellent theologian that he was without his tent making? Because I think like he had his mind on heaven, but like according to like with him, Priscilla and Aquila, they're stitching camel's hair together to make these tents. And it's not like it's a sweaty job. We know it because his sweaty thing got carried away and healed people. Forget that's another kind of thing. But I mean, when you think about it, it's like, this is like, he had a sense of Paul had a sense of this part of it, this workmanship, the way that Brother Lawrence had a sense of what it was to be like a simple worker in a kitchen and a shoemaker. And God fills his heart with revelations that helped people. And so we got it from Paul. Yeah. So if Paul is just like, a head, a talking head and a mind with no heart and no skill, hand-to-hand skill, then that is, Peter and John, James, fishermen, and that's the way it was. And you go back at the end of Exodus and you got those two guys, Aholiab and Bezalel. They have to stitch everything together to get the tabernacle right. And when it's right and it's set up, the presence of God comes down. It's like, this is like maybe, the Bible's like very practical in some places, very contemplative and spiritual in other places. It's all together lovely.
Yeah, it's a good mix. Like Paul's got his famous trio that he throws out there: the athlete, the soldier, and the farmer.
That's right.
He just keeps.
You're right.
Paul drops those, and you said, "Wait a minute." He just said it here. He just said it. Especially the pastoral epistles, he keeps dropping it. So it's always these hands-on things, and I guess that's why Brother Lawrence is so relatable.
Yes.
Because the average layman, you read about a guy who's doing regular menial work, so you feel you fit in. Right, it's not beneath you; it's like around you. It's your life, and I like his intimacy. You could be simple and not intimate.
That's true. You're right.
Some relationships you have are very, very simple, but they're not intimate. I know you, you know me, you know my name. That's simple, but there's no intimacy. Yeah. And why did Jesus come? To give man the opportunity for intimacy that was lost in the garden.
Yes.
Of all the things that you read in the Old Testament, the thing you see that man struggles with from the fall is intimacy. You get it sometimes in worship, in sacrifice, but there was not some with abiding intimacy. The with abiding presence of the Holy Spirit created the with abiding presence of intimacy. And Brother Lawrence just leans into it. I'm not smart. I'm not good with words. I'm bad with my hands. I'm not making tents. I'm a lousy valet. I wasn't a great soldier. I was not the best monk in the monastery. I didn't have the best job. I didn't write any books. I wasn't a literary. I wasn't a scholar or a scribe. And yet I had the intimacy of God.
And he answered the call. I think someone writes him a letter. Mm-hmm. He doesn't dismiss it. He gives the answer. Mm-hmm. He said the presence of God, you're struggling with a relationship. The answer is the presence of God in your own heart. Stop trying to figure out how to change the other person. Mm-hmm. You figure out how to find a deeper walk with God in what you're doing. That's right good. There. And that was pretty much the way that he counseled people. Mm-hmm. And every, a variety of situations. This woman talks about this. This one's going through an affliction. This one, is a soldier, and a soldier is very pained about being a soldier. He's like saying, be a good soldier. Yeah. Be a good soldier for the glory of God. And, I think when I first read this book, when I was a new Christian, someone gave me the book. I found the book and I started reading, and I thought, this is really a good book. This was one that I read early. Another one was called Joy by Warren Wiersbe, about the Philippians. Joy. I wrote that.
I read that.
Be joyful. That's the name of it. That was one of the first ones, and I got that. And then there was another one by Fenelon that's called Let Go. These books were like, when I, a Christian 1 or 2 years, and I'm working at Burger King, so I have these books, and they're little books, and with Brother Lawrence, it's like identifiable. I'm flipping my Whopper while I'm thinking with God, and
have that problem all the time.
Huh?
I have that problem all the time.
Yeah. So, but I think this is a good place to start. This is a good, if you're struggling with framing your prayer life, and I think all of us, would admit that we have times in our lives when we know we should pray, we know we should be better people who pray. We should be better at prayer, but the will is there, but the power to do it must come from the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And this is where Brother Lawrence got, and we think that you can look through his pattern and develop a way of sensing God in everything that you do.
That's beautiful.
And I think going through this week, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about what's happening at Greater Grace this week.
Oh, yeah.
And going through this week, we're devoting ourselves to talking about these prayer warriors on our podcast.
Yes.
But on our campus, what's happening?
Well, at our campus, we've kind of decided to aim everything we're doing toward the theme of prayer. Every lunch wrap is targeted towards the theme of prayer. All the grace hours this week are talking about historical prayer warriors of the faith. Here on campus, on property, 6025 Moravia Park Drive, we have prayer from 8 to 10, from 1 to 3, and from 7 to 9, starting Tuesday night. Tuesday night is the kickoff. It'll be from 7 to 9. Yeah. And then Monday from 7 to 9. Then Tuesday it'll be the 8 to 10, 1 to 3, 7 to 9. Tuesday, we have 8 to 10 on Wednesday. We have 1 to 3 on Wednesday. Service. Yeah. Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. And then Thursday, we have again 8 to 10, 1 to 3, 7 to 9. And then we have the same thing on Friday. Come on down, be a part. There's nothing more edifying than praying with the body of Christ.
It's true.
It is as important as worship. And I want to give you a couple quotes from prayer from Brother Lawrence that I've kind of wrote down. The first one he says is, prayer is nothing else than the sense of God's presence. Another thing Brother Lawrence says is, you need not cry very loud. He is nearer to us than we think. Another thing he says is, I have abandoned all particular forms of devotion, all prayer techniques. My only prayer practice is attention. I give God my attention. I carry on a habitual, silent, secret conversation with God that fills me with overwhelming joy. And then he says this, the most holy and important practice in the spiritual life is the presence of God. That is every moment to take great pleasure that God is with you.
There you go. There you go. I think we've given you a good start to your week. And as we said, you can listen to the podcast and learn more about other great figures of prayer. And I think you're going to see that they all have this, they all sense that without God, this is impossible. And
Amen.
Just like Brother Lawrence is saying there, that this is, he hears our cries. So for Pastor Renaldo Brown, I'm Pastor Steve Andrulonis, and we want to thank Jehu for being our engineer today. This is the Grace Hour Show, and if you want to listen to more and you want to be, hear it all over again, you can find it archived at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and more. Also, the gracehour.org, gracehour.org is the podcast website. You can find all of our past programs there. And thank you for being a part of the Grace Hour Show today. Join us again tomorrow. Subscribe, will you? That'd be great.